Rosie O'Donnell called a Harvard-educated Congresswoman "sweetie," then questioned her intelligence. The room froze. Millions watched in silence as Jasmine Crockett rose, not in anger, but in mastery. What followed wasn't a debate. It was a demolition. How did a celebrity icon get publicly dismantled by calm, brutal facts? Keep watching. Before we get to this explosive moment, tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe truth still matters, hit subscribe. We've got another jaw-dropping story coming tomorrow. The lights in the studio glared softly against the polished table. The crowd at the View had just settled, their applause tapering into polite silence. Rosie O'Donnell shifted in her chair, leaned forward, and with a smirk that dripped condescension, locked eyes with the woman seated across from her. "Sweetie," Rosie said, her tone syrupy and sharp, "maybe stick to what you know, whatever that is." Gasps burst from the live audience, like air sucked from a room. Joy Behema stopped mid-nod. Whoopi Goldberg's jaw visibly tightened. Sunny Hostin blinked slowly and looked away. Everyone knew what had just happened, but no one dared say it. Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She stared back at Rosie, calm, poised. 3 seconds passed. Then she gently leaned forward, hands clasped, voice steady. "Did you just question my intelligence on national television?" The air felt electric. The studio froze in collective anticipation. Rosie chuckled awkwardly, not realizing what she had triggered. Because what Rosie thought was a witty jab was actually the first domino in her unraveling. She had just made the fatal mistake of underestimating a Harvard-trained attorney, a former public defender, and a sitting congresswoman who had dismantled prosecutors and CEOs alike with nothing but facts and precision. Rosie had no idea she'd walked into a legal ambush. By the time Jasmine was finished, no one in America would remember Rosie's smug remark. They'd remember the moment the smile vanished from her face, and the day Jasmine Crockett rewrote the rules of televised confrontation with grace, facts, and devastating clarity. This wasn't just a moment. It was a reckoning. Rosie O'Donnell had built an empire on her voice, loud, brash, unfiltered. In the 1990, that voice carried her to the top of daytime television. She was funny, fast-talking, and fearless. But as the decades wore on, Rosie shifted from entertainment into political commentary. Her tone changed, the humor faded. What remained was the same volume, now loaded with condescension. Twitter became her playground. Her followers, once charmed by her wit, now watched her lash out daily at Gen Z politicians and TikTok legislators. She labeled them keyboard law people who, in her view, cared more about trending hashtags than policy. Rosie styled herself as a battle-tested veteran of political discourse, despite never having passed a bill, run for office, or served her country in public service. So when The View's producers brought her back as a guest co-host, they knew she'd boost ratings. Rosie saw more than that. She saw an opportunity to reassert her dominance and remind everyone that Rosie O'Donnell still had teeth, not charm, bite. Backstage, she didn't hide her disdain. "Some of these new politicians," she said, loud enough for staffers to hear, "think clout is the same thing as credentials." She didn't mention Jasmine Crockett's name, but everyone knew who she meant. It was in the way Rosie scoffed at the intern scrolling through Crockett's congressional page. It was in the snide laugh when Jasmine introduced herself with composure and clarity. Rosie didn't just dislike Crockett's generation. She resented it. To Rosie, Crockett represented everything she wasn't. Educated, informed, respected in D.C., not Hollywood, and above all, unimpressed by celebrity theatrics. This wasn't going to be an interview for Rosie. It was going to be a test, a confrontation she thought she could control, where her decades of fame would outweigh someone else's hard-earned authority. But Rosie never studied the docket. She mistook Crockett's calm for passivity, her grace for weakness. And when she smirked across the table and dropped the condescending "sweetie," she didn't just light a fuse, She detonated her own image. Because the guest she tried to humiliate wasn't just another politician. She was a courtroom assassin, disguised in poise. Jasmine Crockett didn't build her reputation on theatrics. She built it brick by brick, through trials, advocacy, and the long, grueling grind of public service. She wasn't born with a platform. She earned it. After graduating from Rhodes College with a degree in business, she entered Harvard Law School, where she stood out not by being loud, but by being relentless. Her professors knew her as the one who asked the toughest questions. Her classmates knew she was the one you wanted on your side in a legal clinic. She didn't just learn law, she lived it. She became a public defender in Texas, where she spent years standing between marginalized communities and a system built to break them. She wasn't there for applause. She was there to stop another name from becoming a statistic. To her, law wasn't theory, it was a weapon, and she learned to wield it with precision. Eventually, Crockett transitioned into politics, first in the Texas State House, then in Congress. She brought the same tenacity with her. Her questioning style was surgical, calm, controlled, but devastating. She didn't yell, she didn't grandstand, she asked one question and watched powerful men squirm. She came to The View to talk policy, specifically her criminal justice reform bill. Her goal was simple: explain her legislation clearly to the American public. She had no interest in confrontation, but that didn't mean she wasn't ready for one. Rosie's early passive jabs didn't go unnoticed. Crockett filed them away the way a trial attorney logs irrelevant objections. She wasn't rattled. She was calculating. She didn't see Rosie as a threat. She saw her as noise. Background commentary from someone used to being heard but not necessarily understood. Jasmine Crockett didn't prepare to spar with Rosie O'Donnell. She prepared to represent her constituents with integrity and clarity. But when Rosie crossed the line, when she dismissed Jasmine's Harvard education as little law school classes and questioned whether she understood complex issues, Crockett didn't flinch. She steadied herself. Because unlike Rosie, Crockett didn't need to talk over someone to win a conversation. She didn't come armed with attitude. She came armed with facts. And when the moment came, she was ready, not to argue, but to dismantle. With elegance. With facts. And with finality. Jasmine Crockett sat poised, hands folded, her voice smooth as she outlined the heart of her criminal justice reform bill. She wasn't grandstanding. She was educating, breaking down systemic sentencing disparities and how they impact minority communities. Her language was clear, her tone deliberate, every point built logically on the last. You could hear a pin drop in the studio. That's when Rosie O'Donnell leaned forward, interrupting with a dismissive laugh. "Hold on. Harvard," she said, voice dripping with sarcasm. "These are complicated things. You really think the average person's following all that lawyer speak?" The studio collectively winced. Audience members looked at each other in disbelief. Joy Behar's expression faltered. Whoopi Goldberg shifted slightly in her chair, her eyes narrowing as she glanced sideways at Rosie. Jasmine didn't flinch. She turned slowly, expression calm, voice steady. "Well," she began, "after graduating summa cum laude with a business degree and earning my JD from Harvard Law School, I practiced as a public defender for over a decade, arguing cases before state and federal judges. Then I wrote legislation in Texas before joining the House Judiciary Committee. So yes, I do believe I'm qualified to explain this clearly." Rosie let out a scoffing laugh. "Okay, I've been around this game longer than you've even been paying attention." That was the moment Jasmine's eyebrow lifted, just slightly. She smiled. "I'm 42, she said coolly. "You started your career in the mid-80s, so technically no. You haven't been doing this longer than I've been alive. But nice try." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Even Sunny Hostin covered her mouth. The co-hosts chuckled nervously, but Rosie's cheeks flushed crimson. That should have been her cue to pull back. But Rosie O'Donnell didn't take cues. He took it personally. And Jasmine Crockett had just baited the trap, quietly, cleanly. What came next would not be a comeback. It would be a dismantling. The laughter hadn't faded before Rosie doubled down, her pride wounded and her tone sharp. "Sweetie," she said, cutting Jasmine off with a condescending smile. "Maybe stick to what you know, whatever that is. These aren't little law school classes. This is real life." The room froze. It wasn't just the word sweetie. It was the tone, the dismissiveness, the belittling, and the fact that it was said on live television in front of millions. The cameras captured everything, the co-host's stunned expressions, the way Sunny Hostin recoiled slightly, and Whoopi Goldberg's slow turn toward Rosie, eyes wide with something between disbelief and disappointment. The air was suddenly electric with tension. The studio audience gasped, then fell utterly silent. But Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't fire back in anger. She simply lowered her tone. "Let's talk about qualifications," she said softly, her eyes locked on Rosie's. Rosie leaned back smugly, clearly mistaking Jasmine's restraint for retreat. She crossed her arms and gave a nod. "Please," she said with mock courtesy, "enlighten me." And just like that, the conversation turned. Jasmine didn't need the audience. She didn't need applause. She needed one thing: facts, and she had them lined up like legal citations in a closing argument. With every word, Jasmine began constructing her case. She started with her years as a public defender, detailing how she'd handled hundreds of cases under pressure, defending people who had no voice. She moved into her tenure in the Texas state legislature, where she authored reforms that passed with bipartisan support. Then she transitioned to her current position on the House Judiciary Committee, explaining the constitutional issues she confronts on a weekly basis. Rosie's smug expression began to fade, not all at once, but bit by bit, like a slow collapse. What she thought was a battle of bravado had suddenly turned into a courtroom. And Jasmine Crockett was about to bring the full weight of her preparation to bear. The bait had been taken, the line had been crossed. Now came the consequences. Jasmine leaned forward slightly, voice steady, gaze unblinking. "Since we're talking about qualifications," she said, "let's be precise." She laid it out like a closing argument. Undergraduate degree in business administration from Rhodes College, summa cum laude. Juris Doctor from Harvard Law School. Not little law school classes, but federal constitutional law seminars, criminal procedure clinics, and moot court championships. She described her years in the trenches as a public defender, walking into courtrooms across Texas with files in hand, facing down prosecutors, fighting for the forgotten. Not in theory, on the record, hundreds of cases, real people, real consequences. Then, Congress. Committee work, judiciary hearings, not photo ops, but grilling attorneys general, dissecting statutes, and defending constitutional integrity. She didn't name drop for applause. She cited legislative accomplishments, language she authored, provisions she fought to include. Rosie's face reddened, but Jasmine wasn't done. She reached into her folder. "I brought receipts," she said calmly. She read aloud a few of Rosie's infamous tweets, one where Rosie claimed the Constitution was written in 1796, another where she insisted impeachment required a unanimous Senate vote, and a third insisting the Supreme Court had 12 justices. "These aren't opinions," Jasmine said, holding up the printouts. "They're factual errors, and they weren't made 20 years ago. They were posted this year." The audience was silent. Then Jasmine delivered the knockout. "My legislation, the Criminal Justice Reform Act, contains 3 core provisions: sentencing equity, rehabilitation investment, and judicial oversight. Which one do you disagree with? And which legal precedent are you using to support that?" Rosie blinked, opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Jasmine waited. And when silence answered back, she nodded. "I thought so." Then came the line that detonated across social media within minutes. Next time you question someone's intelligence, make sure you're qualified to have that conversation. The studio erupted, audience on their feet, co-hosts stunned. Rosie O'Donnell sat frozen, exposed under the lights, not just wrong, but outmatched. In under 5 minutes, Jasmine Crockett had turned an insult into a national moment. And Rosie had handed her the platform to do it. The energy on set had completely shifted. Gone was the smugness in Rosie O'Donnell's posture, replaced by a stiff, uncomfortable stillness. She blinked rapidly, her mouth slightly ajar as the audience erupted, not with laughter or applause for her, but with a deep, rolling cheer that felt like vindication. The applause wasn't for volume. It was for precision and for the woman who had just turned Rosie's insult into the sharpest comeback day television had seen in years. Jasmine Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She adjusted her microphone, nodded once toward the moderator, and returned her hands to her lap like nothing monumental had occurred. But something had. Something irreversible. America had just witnessed a televised shift in power, not between two celebrities, but between two visions of authority. One built on ego, legacy, and outdated bravado. The other rooted in discipline, knowledge, and earned respect. The applause wasn't just for the kill shot, it was for what it represented. Rosie hadn't just lost the argument, she'd lost control of the room. The View's producers, watching from the control room, exchanged frantic glances. This wasn't the controversy they'd hoped for. They wanted drama, sure, but not one of their guest hosts being intellectually dismembered on live TV. The director cut briefly to a wide shot of the panel, but even that couldn't distract from Rosie's flushed expression and frozen eyes. She looked cornered. She looked exposed. Jasmine, meanwhile, returned to what she came to do, talk policy. She picked up right where the interruption had derailed her, describing Section 2 of her Criminal Justice Reform Act. She spoke about federal rehabilitation incentives, post-conviction educational access, and judicial accountability, with the calm cadence of a woman who knew her subject better than anyone else in the room. Her voice didn't waver. Her hands didn't shake. She wasn't debating. She was leading. Joy Behar leaned in, visibly impressed. Sunny Hostin scribbled a note. Even Whoopi Goldberg gave a slight nod, arms crossed in quiet respect. Rosie, voice suddenly fragile, tried to jump in. I just think experience. Jasmine didn't even look at her. She continued speaking, answering Whoopi's question instead about how the bill addresses racial disparities in sentencing. Rosie's words dissolved in mid-air. No one acknowledged her. And that, more than the tweets, the credentials, the law school background, that was the real turn. Jasmine didn't just win the argument. She made Rosie irrelevant. For Rosie, a woman who built her identity on being impossible to ignore, being ignored on live television was the deepest cut of all. As Jasmine calmly answered policy questions with clarity and command, Rosie O'Donnell sat like a relic from a different era, present but no longer relevant. The weight of her arrogance, once mistaken for confidence, now pulled heavily on her shoulders. For the first time in decades, Rosie wasn't the center of attention. She wasn't even in the conversation. She had become the cautionary tale unfolding in real time. The audience, sensing the dynamic, shifted with unmistakable clarity. Whispers rippled through the studio. A few audience members looked at Rosie, then back at Jasmine, shaking their heads in quiet disbelief. The cameras kept rolling, but all focus was on Congresswoman Crockett. Her voice, her ideas, her command of the room. Rosie had intended to humiliate her. Instead, she had become the subject of her own undoing. Her trademark brashness no longer read as entertaining. It came off petty, insecure, desperate. Every glance she stole at the camera now seemed like a search for a lifeline, a way to recover the spotlight that had so decisively moved on without her. But no one was throwing her a rope, not even the co-hosts. Sunny Hostin, who had once admired Rosie for her progressive stances, now kept her focus on Jasmine. Joy Behar offered no witty rescue lines. And Whoopi Goldberg? She didn't even glance in Rosie's direction. Her silence was louder than any rebuke. Then came the moment Rosie tried to recover. She leaned into the mic, offering a nervous laugh, the kind performers use when the joke has failed but the show must go on. "Well, I guess I won't be arguing with a Harvard lawyer again anytime soon." The laugh didn't land. It echoed briefly, then faded into dead air. No applause, no validation, just awkwardness. And a haunting realization. Rosie O'Donnell had just lost something far more valuable than a debate. She had lost the room, and perhaps the last remnants of her credibility. Camera zoomed in on Jasmine, who gave no reaction. Her silence was strategic, surgical. She didn't need to bury Rosie. Rosie had already done that herself. Viewers at home felt the shift too. Social media exploded with side-by-side screenshots. Jasmine poised, focused. Rosie slack-jawed, visibly unraveling. Hashtags like Rosie folded and Crockett crushed began trending. TikTokers clipped the moment Rosie's smirk faded into stunned silence and looped it under dramatic soundtracks. The internet wasn't just watching, it was documenting the collapse of a once dominant voice in real time. Legend of Rosie O'Donnell, media titan, political firebrand, cultural force, was crumbling before the eyes of a new generation that demanded substance, not stardom. And in her place stood Jasmine Crockett, calm, brilliant, unbothered. Rosie came to destroy a rising star. Instead, she accidentally crowned her. The commercial break couldn't come fast enough for Rosie O'Donnell. The moment the cameras stopped rolling, she yanked off her mic, muttered something unintelligible about needing fresh air, and stood up so quickly her chair rocked backward. Without looking at anyone, not the producers, not the co-hosts, not even Jasmine, she walked off the set. Not with dignity, not with purpose, just gone. Everyone sat frozen. Whoopi slowly turned her head, watching Rosie vanish behind the curtains. A studio that had just been electrified moments before was now swallowed by an eerie silence, the kind that follows a seismic shift no one saw coming but everyone now feels. Joy Behar blinked twice, unsure whether to laugh or grimace. Sunny Hostin leaned over her desk, eyes locked on Jasmine, not in shock but in reverence. And Jasmine? She didn't move. She remained seated, calm as ever, posture straight, hands still gently folded on the table. She didn't look pleased. She didn't look smug. She simply looked unshaken, like the storm had passed and she had remained untouched by the winds. Her eyes, though held fire, controlled, focused, regal. The director in the control booth scrambled to reconfigure the segment. Backup guests were paged, notes were shuffled. But it didn't matter. Because Jasmine Crockett had just delivered the segment of the year, and there was no recovering the show's original script. America wasn't going to talk about The View's scheduled topic. They were going to talk about what they'd just witnessed, a political beatdown so surgical it forced a cultural icon to retreat in real time. A crew member whispered that Rosie was outside, pacing, chain-smoking, refusing to speak to anyone. She wouldn't be coming back. Ever, perhaps. Inside, Whoopi cleared her throat and addressed the audience, half in jest, half in admiration. Well, I guess we all learned something about underestimating people today. Applause. Applause. Not forced, not polite, but full-throated, cathartic, and unified. The audience stood, not for Rosie, not for the drama, but for Jasmine Crockett, who had just taught the nation what composure, competence, and confidence look like under pressure. As they resumed taping, Jasmine continued discussing her criminal justice reform bill with Sunny and Joy. Her tone didn't waver, her facts didn't falter. There was no gloating, no victory lap. She didn't need one. The contrast was already seared into public memory. Rosie's walk-off became the most downloaded clip of the day. Edited into memes, overlaid with soundtracks, it was spliced into reaction videos, parodies, and commentary across YouTube and TikTok. But what people remembered most wasn't Rosie's exit. It was the image of Jasmine, unshaken, speaking to millions with the steadiness of someone who didn't need to raise her voice to dominate a room. Rosie thought she was hosting. Jasmine ended up teaching. And in that moment, as one woman walked off in humiliation, another walked into history. Without moving an inch. It didn't take long. Within minutes of the confrontation area, the internet ignited like wildfire. The hashtag Crockett destroys Rosie skyrocketed past 1 million tweets in under 2 hours, with users from all political sides stunned by what they'd just witnessed. On live television, clips of Jasmine Crockett's now legendary response flooded timelines across X, Instagram, and TikTok, where creators added dramatic music, reaction cuts, and subtitles. Some dubbed it a live legal evisceration. Others called it the moment Rosie O'Donnell's career flatlined. By the 24-hour mark, a TikTok compilation of Jasmine calmly dismantling Rosie's credibility had over 10 million views and 800,000 shares. One post spliced Jasmine's takedown with the words, "Exhibit A, don't come for a Harvard-trained lawyer unless you brought a bar license." Comment sections turned into digital courtrooms, and Rosie was unanimously declared guilty of arrogance, ignorance, and condescension. Rosie's Wikipedia page didn't survive the blow either. Users quickly edited her bio to include the line, "Got Crocketed on The View in 2025. It was quickly reverted by moderators, but screenshots had already been shared across the internet. Memes exploded. One showed Jasmine sitting calmly with fire behind her, captioned, "Harvard Law's finest, bringing fire without raising her voice." Another had Rosie's face photoshopped next to a chalkboard reading, "Lesson, don't debate lawyers on their turf." Major media outlets jumped in. CNN ran a segment titled, "Legal Masterclass" on daytime TV, while Fox News, often a critic of Crockett's politics, acknowledged her preparation. "We don't agree with her policies, but her composure was elite." Even the BBC and The Guardian covered the showdown, calling it a moment of cultural reckoning and the rise of courtroom ethics in daytime commentary. Rosie's team scrambled. By midday, 3 of her upcoming talk show appearances were quietly canceled. Her publicist issued a generic statement thanking The View for a spirited discussion, but it didn't stop the bleeding. One producer was overheard saying, "She just got legally mauled. No one's touching this right now." The shift was undeniable. What started as a casual panel became a nationwide reckoning, and the public chose its verdict loud and clear. Crockett didn't just win, she dominated. As Rosie's public image unraveled, Jasmine Crockett's star went supernova. At Harvard Law School, professors paused their regularly scheduled lectures to play clips of Crockett's dismantling of Rosie O'Donnell. One constitutional law professor declared it a textbook example of witness control and rhetorical composure under fire. The clip was immediately added to the school's advocacy curriculum, with one syllabus now listing the moment under. Crockett's legislation, once teetering in the committee backlogs, gained momentum overnight. By week's end, 3 moderate Republicans and 2 skeptical Democrats added their names to the bill as co-sponsors. The Criminal Justice Reform Act, previously viewed as a partisan longshot, was suddenly front-page material. Politico ran the headline, "Crockett turns viral moment into legislative momentum." Speaking requests poured in from across the country. Howard University wanted her to keynote their law school convocation. The NAACP invited her to headline their summer summit on justice reform. Yale, Columbia, and Spelman reached out for guest lectures. Even international human rights conferences began inquiring, requesting her insight on American legal discourse. Her social media presence tripled in days. Instagram reels of the takedown reached trending status in multiple countries. On X, her follower count jumped by over 400,000 in a week. Verified users from every political stripe retweeted her now legendary closing line. "Next time you question someone's intelligence, make sure you're qualified to have that conversation." Even critics had to concede respect. A Republican congressman told reporters, "I don't agree with her politics, but I respect the hell out of the preparation." She didn't flinch. She made her case like a lawyer should, with facts and calm fury. Jasmine Crockett had become more than a viral clip. She became a symbol of unshakable dignity, sharp intellect, and grace under pressure. While Rosie faded into the background, Crockett's presence expanded beyond the panel table, beyond the trending topics, into something far more lasting. She was no longer just the Congresswoman from Texas. She was the new face of political credibility in America's chaotic media landscape. Rosie O'Donnell came to that stage believing her fame was enough, that her years behind the microphone gave her the right to diminish someone else's intellect. But what unfolded wasn't just a clash between a celebrity and a congresswoman. It was a reckoning, a televised showdown where preparation met arrogance and experience triumphed over ego. Jasmine Crockett didn't just defend herself. She didn't yell, she didn't insult, and she didn't retreat. Instead, she let the facts speak. Her tone stayed even, her argument precise. Her presence unshakable. She transformed a hostile ambush into a teachable moment, not just for Rosie, but for every viewer who's ever been talked down to, underestimated, or dismissed. This wasn't just about Rosie O'Donnell. It was about every woman who's been told she's too young, too bold, too educated, too black, too articulate, or just too much for the room she's in. Jasmine's response was more than a rebuttal. It was a declaration. A line in the sand. A moment when millions of people saw what it looks like when dignity meets disrespect. And dignity wins. If you're tired of watching pundits shout and smear their way across our screens, if you're exhausted by arrogance disguised as authority, if you believe in facts, in focus, and in fearless representation, then this channel is for you. At Agorophiles, we're not just telling stories. We're exposing the moments that define who holds power and how that power is used or abused. We shine a spotlight on the courageous, the prepared, the underestimated voices who walk into the fire and refuse to back down. So if this moment moved you, if you felt the chill when Jasmine delivered that final line, do not let it stop here. Hit that subscribe button. Ring the notification bell so you never miss the next takedown. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And share this video with someone who needs to see what real strength looks like. Because this wasn't just a political debate. This was history in motion. And you just witnessed it.